radar on this. Let's see.
No one can
All
argue
right,
with
listen,
what.
get feedback to me. Everybody's comments are important. We still have time till we have to make a final decision. All right. So let's go ahead. I'm going to go back to share screen. And now I'm going to introduce you to this issue of who is really the Good Samaritan here. What are we talking about? Who are we talking about? Okay, I'm going to get us set up and come to my theme. I'm going to open up my page here for us all so I can make it more legible. Okay, so introduce the topic. And I'm going to talk about Israeli Israelites without Jerusalem. And so you've all heard the term Good Samaritan. And just this week, I came across a headline. It said, Good Samaritans help rescue 14 from a sinking ship. Right, I've highlighted, right? This idea of Good Samaritan. We even have, I'm not sure in California, there's something called the Good Samaritan law that says if you're in good faith, try to save somebody who's in trouble and something bad comes, the consequence, you're indemnified, all right? To encourage people to help. Well, besides the name for a hospital, though, a few people really know what it refers to, and it became famous because primarily a story attributed to Jesus in the Gospel of Luke about a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho. He's attacked by robbers, and the Kohen comes by and sees him and ignores him. And then the Levi comes by and sees him and ignores him. But a Samaritan comes by and he sees him, binds his wounds, gives him oil, pays for the bills at the inn till he recovers. So who is really the good neighbor where it says, V'after echa kamocha? That's the discussion he's talking about. Love your neighbor as yourself. So who is the neighbor? What do we mean by that? And the people around him, who are among themselves the Pharisees, who are discussing with him, say the one who actually acted like a neighbor, showed him mercy. And so that's what it means, he says, to be good neighbor. You do the same thing. So very often in Christian circles, this was intended to say that Jesus is condemning the Jews for looking out for themselves and not for the stranger. However, truth is that if you look at the New Testament, when Jesus is talking, he's talking to Jews. He's not talking to pagans. When he talks to pagans, he's at first reluctant because he says, like casting swine before pearls. I hate to say, but that's direct quotation. Or it is not fit to give bread to the dogs. He's talking about a Canaanite woman. And when Jesus is talking about the Samaritan, he's not saying there's a Kohen, a Levi, and a Roman, not a Kohen, a Levi, and a Greek, but a Samaritan, because what Jesus sees himself is if he is the Redeemer, maybe that's how he sees himself, then the Samaritans are children of Israel who are going to come together in with the people, the rest of the people of Israel. That's what he's pitching, right? And we have to understand Jesus as a nationalist Jew, very much so. Well, here's our real Samaritans, not the one in the hospital, not the one on the ship, but notice these guys here, the red turban, which is very characteristic also. Originally Turkish, I think you recognize it from Turks wearing that, still very popular among them, and white robes at their worship. So I was a student in Israel, I don't want to say how many years ago. I set out to find out about these people who are related to Jews, but not Jews. I've got this map for you here. And if you're familiar with the layout of Israel, here is Tel Aviv. Down here where my hand is Jerusalem. Up here is Nablus. Nablus, Shechem, ancient Shechem, the ancient capital of the northern kingdom. And right here under my red circle, there is Har Gerizim, the Mount of Gerizim, where there is the Samaritan center number one. Circle number two, just south of Tel Aviv, is Holon. And that's where the other large Samaritan center is. Now, when I say large is very relative, and you'll soon see why I say that. So I had relatives in Holon, and I would visit them from time to time. I was a student in Jerusalem, and one day of Shabbat, I decided to walk across Holon to the Samaritan community. And so I don't really remember too much about that visit, but I remember more about later visits. Well, that half that was living in Israel, among Jews, basically since 1948, were absorbed as citizens of Israel, were essentially Israelis. The ones who were in Nablus had been living among the Palestinians. separate. So I'll talk about that. But here, just briefly, from the BBC, an account that I just took a clip out of. The reporter is interviewing Benjamin or Benny Tzedakah. Notice the singer, for those of you who came on at the very beginning, I had Sophie Tzedakah. It's one of the prominent families. Tzedakah, from Tzedakah, righteousness. It was a scholar, historian, ambassador at large for the Israelite Samaritans. Explains two ancient kingdoms, Judea, the Jews from the south, and we're the tribes from the north. We separated, but our origins are identical. Now, this is one of the world's oldest and smallest religious groups, and the songs among the most ancient of the world. When I say smallest, again, you're going to see what I mean. So, as I said, the north, the two centers, Samaria, Shomron. In the Hebrew, Samaria became the anglicized Greek term, Shomron, hence Shomronim, but also Shamerim, the watchers of the faith, keepers of the faith. That's how they interpret or use the term Shomronim, from Shamerim, the watchers, the keepers, from Shomer, one who keeps. So how did they get to Cholon? As I said, this center in Nablus or Shechem is their actual center. Well, at the turn of the century, 20th century, it's Yitzchak ben Tzvi. So as Jews are coming back to re-enter the land of Israel, one Jew is Yitzchak ben Tzvi from the Ukraine, and he rented a room in Yafo. Yafo is heavily Arab, and the owner was a Samaritan, and he developed a strong friendship. He studied Samaritan culture and history and became an expert in the field. One of the things, interesting things that Yitzhak ben Tzvi, who later became president, did was to look for all the different, quote, lost Jewish communities. Now, they weren't lost to themselves. They knew where they were. It's we lost them, but they lost us. So this was one of his big activities. And so he allocated a plot in Cholon for those Samaritans who wished to live in Israel and be part of the new coming Yishuv and later on state of Israel. And I have a quote where if you want to go look at it, you can follow the link. And so now, here is the entrance to the synagogue in Cholon, and you can see the handwriting on the wall. The writing on the wall looks very different from what we know as Hebrew. And I'll explain to you why that is, and how their Hebrew developed. And you do see this 7-branch candelabra. You do see that as part of the motif. You also see there in the background some kind of glass or stained glass with 12 stones, colored stones. Again, a motif that we as Jews use. So I had another encounter. I went on a tour of the West Bank. This was, again, when I was a student, and then there was no demarcation anymore between Israel and the Palestinians. It was all one blur, and you could travel back and forth without any problem. And the Arabs of the West Bank, and even the Arabs of Gaza, the former Jordanians, did not care at that point. You could travel back and forth very easily. So we came to Nablus. Now, Nablus gets its name from the Roman word Neapolis, the new city, same name as Naples in Italy, Neapolis, but without the pizza. And Nablus, because there's no P sound in Arabic, it becomes a B. But this is also the region of the capital of ancient northern Israel, Shechem. And the Samaritan settlement there is called Kiryat Luza. Kiryat Luza, the city of Luza. And Luza probably referring to a biblical term where Jacob goes out of Israel, maybe, and uses the term Luz as he's going north towards his mother's hometown. Now, it's very important because this area around Shechem is referred to many places in the Bible, and we have also archaeological evidence that Shechem was very well the first city settled by the ancient Israelites before the Exodus. You may recall the story of the rape of Dinah and the revenge of Simon and Levi. And even Jacob says, B'harbi b'kashti, I took it with my bow and arrow. Right? So right there at Shechem, we have two significant mountains, Har Eval and Har Gerizim, the Mount of the Curse and the Mount of Blessings. And there are archaeological remains of an ancient altar on the hillside. Okay, so very important. It's mentioned in Devarim. It's mentioned in their copy of the Torah, but they have a significant change, and I'll show that to you in a second. Well, here is that altar, the remains of the altar. You can see a ramp, kevis, leading up to the altar, square, slight larger stone there, and then inside would have been an altar with 4 corners, right? The ramp leading up. So it is here that the ancient center of the Samaritans lies. They no longer have the original altar. The original temple has long since been destroyed also, but they have a center there. And I came to them, and it was right on Yom Kippur when I came to them. And they're all in the synagogue there, fasting. But this was 1 month after our own Yom Kippur. And so we know, of course, the Samaritans have their own calendar. There are many mentionings of calendars in older biblical texts or non-biblical texts, Book of Jubilees and so on. And if you don't count the additional month at the same time in order to balance the calendar, you're always going to be off somehow. Well, that's what happened here. And another thing, everyone was fasting, including the little children. Again, indication their halacha is not ours. So I was intrigued also. I saw many of them looked very similar. In fact, I found quite a bunch of them with red hair. And it turns out they have slightly higher percentage of red hair than in general population. And if we think of Jews as cousins to each other, and Samaritans are kissing cousins, they're a very close-knit community with a very small genetic pool. And so I'm going to give you an introduction about them with this video. Let me pull it up on the Samaritans. And I'm going to play this for you. Just going to play part of it, not the whole thing. A little dramatic opening, but you can read the text. It tells you a little bit about how the Samaritans refer to themselves. Shomrei Haemet, right? Not the Aramaic Hebrew, but keepers of the truth, right? Shomrim, Shomerim. Okay. Basically, the text, it goes into it, but they talk about how they're trying to find wives for themselves outside the community. There's just not many. But here we go. We're going to expand the screen. For a second. The music doesn't fit them because the music is from the Yom Kippur liturgy of our prayer book, not their liturgy. It's the Kinei Kachomer.
אני הכהן הגדול של השומרונים. אתם הראשונים שאני מדבר איתכם. אני היחיד בכל הכהנים. שאני מכהן גדול, מכהן גדול, מכהן גדול, מכהן גדול. אחד משומרונים, הוא רוצה להיות כהנים אסור. רק מכהן בן כהן יהיה כהן. אנחנו שומרונים, גרים בפלסטין, בשכם העתיקה. לפני 3,000 שנה. השומרונים היו מיליונים, רק בזמן רומאי, מזמן, אין יהודי ואין שומרוני, היו כולם ביחד. רק דוד המלך ושלמה המלך עשו את בית המקדש בירושלים, ואנחנו לא מאמינים בירושלים. זה, הנה, אנחנו הר הברכה, זה הבית המקדש, הנה הוא הר גריזים אצלנו. עכשיו אנחנו ראינו הרבה מלחמות. אנחנו ראינו את הטורקיים, ראינו את האנגליש, ראינו את העיראקים, ראינו את הירדנים, אחר כך ראינו את הפלסטין. ועכשיו אנחנו רוצים להיות שלום בין יהודים ובין ערבים. כל השומרונים בעולם 670 נפש, 340 גרים בחולון, 330 גרים במשטר. מה זה עם מיליון יהודים, 8 מיליון, ערבים בו 3 מיליון, 4 מיליון. מה אנחנו, 600, מה עושה בין מיליונים?
Yeah, okay. If you want to go back, shrink the screen. All right, we'll go back to more on the Samaritans. It gives you, for example, some of the services. Then it goes on to look how they're looking for new brides, because if you could read the commentary, the English translation, you could see there's only 600 or 700 of them, not very many. So, as I said, what happened was that in 48, the community was split. The Cholon Samaritans were more Israelified. The Nablus Samaritans, quote, Palestinians, but since 67, I think there's been a drive among them to be more closely identified with Israel proper than with the Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank. And so another time after that, I went to visit the home. Went back to Cholon. This was many years later when I lived in Israel, and went to the home of the active leader, probably the Beni Tzedakah that's mentioned in the first clip that I posted up there. Can't remember the first name, but I remember the name Tzedakah. And at the entrance of the house, he showed me there was an embroidered Shema rather than on parchment, and that's his mezuzah. And then in discussing the status of women in the house, talked about the laws of Nida, ritual separation after menstruation. And again, they have the Torah. They don't have the halakha as we have it. So they follow the biblical restriction of 7 days. Jewish practice an additional 7 days to be careful. On the other hand, the separation is much more severe. So, for example, the woman must live in separate quarters and cannot touch anything such as the kitchen dishes, as that makes them impure for the man. Now, it sounds severe, but they understand how to take it the right way. It's marked as a holiday for the woman. If the woman cannot touch anything, the man needs to cook and take care of the kids, and the women go off by themselves for picnics. So it becomes a woman's holiday. Right? Everything has cost benefit to it. All right. So in the classic Jewish tradition, it's 14 days, but much less strict than the Samaritan. Now it's longer, less strict, short, but more strict. The 14-day may well be because at the end of 14 days, the woman is more fertile. And that's probably the origin of it. The extension, possible, anybody's guess. So let's go back to the Good Samaritans. Who are the Good Samaritans? All right, we use that term, Good Samaritans. Samaritans. In 722, Northern Kingdom, called Israel, was finally destroyed by the Assyrians. Population was exiled. This is as far as we have from our text. And the Assyrian style of dealing with empire was to scatter the conquered nations around the empire. The theory being, and they scattered these northern Israelites as far as Afghanistan and the borders of India. There's some remnants of populations there in Afghanistan that claim to have Jewish ancestry. The Assyrian method was divide and scatter. Right? It was preventing the conquered peoples from ever becoming a fifth column in their midst and getting together and revolting against the Assyrian lords. So ever since, we've been waiting for the lost tribes to return. And we presume that those who were exiled were lost for the most part by assimilation. And for a variety of reasons about how Jewishly Jewish was the Northern Kingdom, how much were they identifying with the Bible or the Torah cult, we'll call it that way. So, and what the Assyrians then did is repopulate the territory with people from other conquered territories. Jews would later call them Kuti, and referring to people from a certain area of what is today Iraq, and that was in Jewish records. Now, so we do also know that many from the Northern Kingdom escaped into Judea. Possibly a lot of our Torah text is what the Northerners had and brought to us. Judea continued another 150 years. And that is, we're getting into the prime of the prophetic era and the teachers and the teachings and maybe finalizing and crystallizing the elements of Judaism. And therefore, when they were exiled, it's possible that the Judeans then were able to keep their Jewish loyalty and identity stronger than those of the North. What the biblical account from our end is that then the people in the North who were the newcomers and may have mingled with the originals found a wild land. They were attacked by wild beasts and out of fear adopted the Israelites' belief from the natives who were there to protect them, praying, believing the God of the land is your God. And that is where they come into the belief in God. That's at least from the Jewish perspective. Samaritans claim they're not descendants of the foreign invaders, but they are the tribes of Ephraim, Manasseh, and Levi, the loyal ones who stayed. And we also do have records that one of the priests of Jerusalem left and settled in the north, became the Kohanim, their Kohen also, the new temple that they now rebuilt. So we have a different perspective from their end. So come 586, we're exiled. Babylonians have a different policy, which is to our benefit. They also reconquered the peoples as a block, kept them intact. They wanted the value of the new conquered peoples and moved them where it was useful for the empire, but as a block. They would be productive for the benefit of the empire. And the exiled Judeans did very well. They moved into good circles within a short time. And 50 years later, the Persian king Cyrus took over the Babylonian Empire, took a new policy, which is be good to all the conquered peoples, and they'll be loyal to you. Let the conquered exiles return, not just Judeans, but everybody return. And it was a very beneficial move for all sides, and it kept the conquered nations loyal. And the Persian Empire was stable for a long time. So it's here that the split begins between the North and the South. Well, there'd always been tension between the North and the South, and it's continuing. So tensions rise between the Samaritans and newly returned Judeans. And when the temple is now being rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah, around 480, 440 BC, there are full-blown conflicts between the two communities. And they go their separate ways under the Seleucid Syrians and the Romans. They separate from the Maccabees, they separate from the Roman rebellion. They have some of their own rebellions against the overlords. Sometimes they're attacked, sometimes they're protected by the overlords. It varies. The communities have their parting of the ways. Well, while Jerusalem and the temple always been central to Judea, the Samaritans insist still today on the sanctity of Har Gerizim, the north, as the site of the original altar. They claim that it was in the time of Eli. Already the story of Eli and Samuel, that Eli split. The sanctuary was in Shiloh, and it's Eli's fault and Samuel's fault that the split took place. And it goes back there. That's what they claim. So at one point, the coin there mentioned millions. It was never millions, but there was as much as about 1 million, perhaps 1.5 million in the Byzantine period, even under the Christian emperors. However, right, so they were not exiled in large numbers as the Jews were by the earlier Roman conquerors, but later under the Christian emperors, they decimated the population intentionally, chased out, persecuted the Samaritans, just as they had done to the Jews, and destroyed the Samaritan temple by the 6th century. Right, so the Romans had destroyed ours in the year 70. Theirs was gone by another 500 years later. So while Jews were also heavily persecuted, we had been establishing ourselves heavily throughout the Roman and Persian world. Remember, we had our base in Mesopotamia. And so if things were going downhill in the land of Israel, we could be okay outside. The Samaritans were predominantly there. There were some other Samaritan colonies outside, but the core was there in the land of Israel. And I think that was a strategic problem because Jews, never in great numbers, still numbered a few millions over the centuries. The Samaritans dwindled to about 100 people at the start of the 20th century, 100 people. And even today, only 700. 100 people, predominantly male also. So they have a problem about brides because they don't want to marry outside the community. We know that. Same as Jews. And so that's one of the problems that they're debating among themselves. So what do we know about their origins? So it's interesting, we carry in our bodies our history. I think we're much more aware of it than any time before. Not so much that they are races, but that there are families of people. And using that, we can know where our families have been. So modern DNA says we're amazingly closer to each other, Ashkenazic and Sephardic to Samaritan, than either of us to the Palestinians, who are pretty close runner-up to us also. But it's interesting where it shows in. Mitochondrial DNA, which is from the mother, is no major difference in Samaritans, Jews, or Palestinians, right? So we all share this kind of Middle Eastern, it's like a Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean typology. I would cover maybe Greeks, the Turks, the Lebanese, Palestinians, and Jews, right? So we keep that typology. But, so the maternal side would be similar, but the interesting part is in the Y chromosome, which is on the father's side, your father's father's father. And it's the Y chromosomes of Jews and Samaritans are more similar to each other than either is to the Palestinians. Striking similarity to the specific Y chromosome most often associated with Jewish men. So there are slight variants because you have such a small gene pool, they'll inevitably have variants. You can trace a common ancestry within the last few thousand years. And so they argued that the Samaritans were not so much the foreigners imported in as really the bulk of Jews that had, or Israelites had remained, and maybe some foreigners brought in. And that indeed that they really represent the core. And they may have taken non-Jewish wives, which may have been from those imported residents of the Assyrian Empire. And that might explain the female side. But the Jews and Samaritans share ancestry 2,500 years ago. So you can see the core source, if you're curious, in 23andMe, blog 23andMe. Kissing cousins. So, distinguishing features of the Samaritans. You look at their Sefer Torah, notice, you've seen the Iranian Sfarim, right? A metal case, a hard case. Theirs, if you look at it carefully, you see it's built up and it's like the Sephardic case is two halves. What they've done is make it into thirds. So it opens up. So the middle section is also encased. But the same, and the ribanim, right? The decorations on the top, similar, the pomegranates on the top. Okay, and you can see the Hagba Galila, the Kohen Gadol there, lifting up the Sefer Torah. And interestingly, he's got a talit with blue stripes. Again, I don't know what their custom is. One of the references is that they consider the tzitzit to be tassels on the white robe itself. They interpret it a little differently from ours. Again, they have the right to their interpretation. But again, picking up the Torah to show to everyone, right? Hard to know which of these are going back to 2,500 years ago. Which of these are going back? Because Jews and Samaritans at some point or other shared a lot of things as they developed. So the Torah text they have, very similar. There are some variants. There are always going to be variants. They're mostly vowel changes, somewhere here and there in their Torah, a word change here and there. The big change is in the sanctity of Gerizim, their center. Now, in our text of the Torah, we have no reference to a particular town where the sanctuary is supposed to be. We talk about that place, but it's not defined in our text of the Torah. We have a vague reference to Abraham going to Har HaMoriah, and it's interpreted as Jerusalem, but there's no direct reference. In the Samaritan version, we have this, it's an appendix to the Ten Commandments. And when you have the Ten Commandments and you have an appendix, you know that's a later edit. One of the scribes wants you to know why. And here's the wording: when you come into the land of Canaan, you write on the stones all the words of this law. Now that we know is in Devarim, but not in Exodus. And it comes for you that you cross the Jordan, raise these stones in Mount Gerizim, you build there an altar on Gerizim. And the mountain across the Jordan indicates where it is, before Gilgal, Galgal. Notice some differences in the phrasing. Galgal instead of Gilgal. It says Alvin Mara, but I realize the va and the wa is the same, so it's really Alon Moreh, which is referenced there, and before Sechem Shechem. Also in Dvarim, where we talk about the curse and the blessing being placed on the mountains, and the way they word it is that the blessing is on Grizim and not on Ebal. And so there is an assumption here that their Torah has variants, but we have a common text going back very far. We can't necessarily say that their text goes back to the destruction of the northern king. We can't say that. But certainly as our texts are being written, they're sharing with us somewhere in the writing and editing that is for them, from their perspective. Now, another thing very important is that their Hebrew writing that they use is similar in many ways to the Hebrew that was in the what we call the early Phoenician style of Hebrew, which the earlier texts of Torah written, and Jews continue using that to some extent still down to the Second Temple days. We find, for example, Bar Kokhba coins, they use this alphabet. But when Ezra and Nehemiah come back from Babylonia, they're using a script that the Jews began to use, influenced by Aramaic, which is also a variation on the early Canaanite Hebrew, the square script, merubah, square, as opposed to ktav ra'atz or dots, right? That's in the history of the development of Hebrew. And that becomes the standard script used by Jews. And so when they're writing the Torah, they want to use that script. They felt they could keep it distinct. They also, I think, wanted to separate themselves from the usage of the Samaritans. And so also, even the Samaritan script is not the same as the original Hebrew alphabet either. It's also evolved. And so if you just take a look at the letter Aleph on the chart, you've got Old Hebrew Aleph. It's off to the left side. And if you look at it, it's a sideways A, letter A. That's the connection with the letter Aleph and A. When it got to the Greeks, they flipped it on its top and it became an A. You just flip it on the side, you'll recognize it. When you come to Hebrew, modern written Hebrew script, we just separated the line across and you got a curve and a line. Then Arabic did something similar with it also. So when it got to the Samaritans, they turned around and looks a little bit like the way we have the Aleph. I'm going to go from this where it says Samaritan manuscript versions, and they go all the way over to the Aleph as we have it. You see, not so far from it. Bet, their letter Bet, over here, very similar to the early Canaanite, ancient Hebrew Bet. They've preserved it. Ours merely opened up. So you can just get a sense of how the two scripts diverged. So they may not look at all the same now, but at their root, very similar. Here's another one, the Zion, which looks like a sideways H in the ancient Hebrew. And I've got my hand on that. If you can see it down on the bottom on the left. You scroll across, you come to the Aramaic, the old Aramaic version, and you see what looks like a letter Z. And you probably can understand that Zion, as it got to the Greeks, became the Z, Zeta, right there. You've got its ancestor there. In the Hebrew version, straightened up with a little curve. Basically, that's what happened. Okay, let's look at something about the sound. Here's the Shema. We all know the Shema. Shema Yisrael. Well, here it is written on the doorposts because they believe you were going to write it on the doorposts. As I told you, I was in the house of Tzedakah. He had it embroidered, usually carved in stone, not on a parchment. That's a rabbinic ordinance that is done in parchment. Why they did it, we don't know. Again, some of these may be to distinguish and separate the two communities. Some may be because we have very different traditions, how it was done. But you're going to have trouble reading it, right? Yeah. Big trouble reading it. So now I'm going to invite you to listen to it. From this, the Samaritan priest. And I'm going to put it online.
Shema. What the meaning Shema?
Hold on, let me get it enlarged. There we go. Notice he said, this is the Shema. The pronunciation, very different. And if you want, listen to this, how they say God's name. we will say Hashem because it doesn't want to say Yotei Vav Ashema, Aramaic. Okay, watch, just follow it carefully. I'll start again.
Shema. What the meaning Shema?
Understand?
No.
Here.
No. Shema Israel here. Shema Israel. Shema Adonai, the name. Hashem. Shema. Yod Hei Vav Hei. Shema. Hashem.
Okay.
Shema Israel. Shema Elohim Shemad. وابطاء شيما إلوك أفكن لبابك وافكن نفسك وافكن مئودك ويؤذي باري ما إلا إشرب أناك أمسابك أيما اللي بابك شننت ما ألبانك ودبرتا بما أفشبتك ببت أبلكتك بديرك بشكامك وفقومك وقاشرت ما لوت على يدك وأنت تافض بإيدك وكاتب لما المزوزات بدك وفشارك. You understand for me?
Okay, so wait, don't go.
Israel Shema. What the meaning Shema?
Okay, so if you notice, it says Shema instead of Shema, the accent on the beginning syllable, and the again, ayin in original Hebrew, Jewish Hebrew, as opposed to Israelite Hebrew, is a heavy ayin. Not among the Samaritans. The other thing that disappears is the letter het. Again, more like these are variant pronunciations the Talmud recognizes also, that people from Haifa and Bet Shan towards the north could not pronounce het. And they couldn't pronounce the ayin, didn't distinguish it. The other thing is the lecha, lak. Again, it's a variant, a northern variant. The end of the pronunciation, that end vowel sound drops. It comes from a soft to a hard, and that's also, and then tzadi, right? If you figure those variations and you know your text, then you all of a sudden start to understand. So they say Shema, Shema, because you don't read God's name. So Shema, listen, Shema, Hashem, and Aramaic, the at the end means instead of the hey at the beginning. Okay, there we got it. A little bit more about them. Key beliefs, key principles, right? Very similar to Jews, one God, Yod He Vav He, the same name, as recognized by the prophets, the unity of God, the unity of Creator, absolute unity, cause of causes, fills the entire world, right? This is common monotheistic principle. I'm sure they're very much aware of what the prophets wrote. They're very much aware of what the rabbis taught. They're very much aware of Muslim philosophers, I'm sure. And so that comes into their own thinking. And they're very, I'm sure they're very aware of all these and adopt these general principles. The Torah now is the only holy book. They don't have any other holy book in that sense. They don't have a Bible. They have only the Torah given by God to Moses. They do have a book of Joshua, similar in some ways to our book of Joshua, but that's it. The rest are commentaries that they have collected over centuries, but not with the status of the Torah. So they don't have the prophets as we have it. They don't have the writings. They certainly don't have Psalms and Proverbs because they don't believe in the authority of David and Solomon. They're from the south, and they're from the north. So there's no oral Torah. There's no Talmud also, right? There's a great break on that. Okay. Moses is the end of the prophets, no other prophets. And that's very important because, that way they distinguish themselves from Christians and they distinguish themselves from Muslims, for whom Muhammad is Ras al-Nabi, the head of the prime of the prophets. And of course, Gerizim, not Jerusalem, is the only sanctuary. They don't recognize Jerusalem. They don't recognize the location of Mount Moriah as we talk about it in Abraham's story and the sacrifice of Isaac. They do have a belief in the apocalypse, end of days, the day of revenge. They have equivalent to a Messiah, Taheb, from Joseph, the tribe of the north, which also is in Jewish legends. There's a Messiah ben David, Messiah ben Joseph, two messiahs, which appears in Jewish literature. So they're picking on something that we also have in our records, right? So again, something may have developed in parallel. And he will be a prophet like Moses, or Moses returned, which also appears in Jewish sources. Moses, redivivus, Moses come back to life, lead the children, returns all the Israelites, then the dead will be resurrected, and then the Taheb will discover the tent of Moses and will be buried next to Joseph, right? Then also one other thing, which is the idea of resurrection. All the resurrection, all the righteous will go to the Garden of Eden. The wicked will be burned with fire. Again, not found in the Bible, not found in the Torah. It is a later development. It is a rabbinic development, but it enters to them also in their beliefs. And let me go ahead then. Some customs, different customs and observances. As I said, they've got a Proto-Hebraic script. It's been varied, but they also have the high priest. They maintain the authority of the Kohen Gadol and the practice of slaughtering the lamb at Pesach Eve. And I'm going to show you that. They have our major festivals. They observe them differently, according to the calendar is different. Rosh Hashanah is Yom Teruah, as it's called in the Torah, but not the New Year, which is also not in the Torah itself. And Pesach is particularly important, with sacrificing for up to 40 sheep. They do have the count of the Omer. They celebrate the week before Shabbat as a special festival. And then Shavuot, a day-long service of continuous prayer. I'm not sure how they identify it with the Ten Commandments or not. I don't know. Sukkot, they build their Sukkot inside the houses, as opposed to outdoor. And so the historian Tzedakah says that perhaps it came to as a result of persecution under the Christians. Very possible. For example, Jews also, when it came to lighting the Hanukkah candles, there were periods of persecutions by the Persians, who generally were tolerant, but there were periods when they persecuted Jews, and we had to hide the Hanukkah candles indoors. We do a lot of things out of survival necessity. The roof of the sukkah, citrus fruits, they use the palm, myrtle, and the willow tree, but all in the roof rather than holding it in their hands for the Arba Minim. And as I said, Yom Kippur, they're much more strict, even breastfeeding infants, right? Fast on Yom Kippur. Maybe that's why there are only 700 left. I don't know. The talit, as I say, is the white gown that you saw. The tzitzit, there are 22 buttons on the lapel, and then there are loops on the opposite side. And that's what they call the tzitzit. And it's the same color. They use the white again, not the tchelet. Although there's some I see have used tchelet, a blue. I've seen that reference. All right, so now here's Seder Pesach. Before there were such things as refrigerators, this is how you got your dinner. Just keep that in mind when you see it. And I'm going to enlarge the screen for us. Also, give me a second on this one.
It's 2:30 in the morning on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritan village appears to be asleep and desolate, but it's not. We begin to notice men dressed in white who resemble biblical figures, coming out of every alley, carrying their prayer mats. They are off to morning prayers. We follow them to the entrance of the synagogue. From outside, we can hear the devotional prayers, as if listening to a voice from the past, a survivor from another era, a voice that has not succumbed to globalization. Eerie or mystical, depending on who you ask. These devotional mantras have been recited by the Samaritans for over 2,000 years, in Samaritan Hebrew, Samaritan Aramaic, and Samaritan Arabic. At 4:30 a.m., the prayers are over, and the Samaritans leave the synagogue, heading to the first holy stop of Mount Gerizim, the center of the world for the Samaritans. walking in the dark through ancient rocky paths. The first station is the place of the 12 stones mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 4. The ritual begins and the scrolls are lifted for the first time. The second stop is at the break of dawn, the altar of Adam and his son Seth, where Adam blessed his son prior to his death. As morning breaks, the Samaritans head to the site of the everlasting hill, mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 15. The sparkling of the Torah scrolls to the rays of the sun at sunrise was a pastoral view of the mountains in the background. This is the site where, according to Samaritan belief, Abraham saw the ram in the thicket when he was about to sacrifice his son Isaac. God will provide. Genesis chapter 28, verse 8. Next stop is the site of the altar of Isaac, the equivalent of Mount Moriah for the Jews. The Samaritans then continue to the altar of Noah. For the Samaritans, Mount Gerizim was the resting place of Noah's Ark, and not Mount Ararat, the widely accepted belief by Christians. It's then time for the final stop, entering the everlasting hill, a site marked in the past by two monuments to Jacob. The Samaritans dedicate their prayers to the Exodus from Egypt and to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They then walk in circles 7 times, greet and hug each other as they have been doing for over 3,000 years, according to their beliefs, against all odds. Daniel Campos, I-24 News.
Okay. All right. So, hold on. 1 second. Let me stop this. There we go. All right. I didn't actually do the Seder, which they do quite literally, sacrificing the lamb, putting the blood on the ground, baking it in the earth on coals, and then eating it on the spot, which we stopped doing a long time ago. Maybe it's just as good they didn't have that in there, because nobody wants to go to the butcher shop when the butcher is butchering the meat. And I'm going to wrap up here, and then I'm going to give us some music, some loving music from the Samaritans. Are they Jews or are they not Jews? How do we relate to them? Well, there's what we call Masechtot Tanor, which are small tractates. They're part of the Talmud, but they're never really studied as such. There's not much commentary on them. But from the Talmudic period, and this one's called Masechet Kutim, the tractate of the Kutim, as I say, Samaritans. Now, this word Kutim, when you're studying Talmud, you come across the word Kutim, that doesn't mean Samaritans. There it means Christians, and so because the Christian censors forced the Jews to write Kuti, Samaritan, instead of Min, for the heretics, because that was about Christians. Just so you know, when you're studying Talmud, that confuses things. But this one is about real Samaritans. So notice it opens up and says the Samaritans in some ways resemble Gentiles, in some ways resemble Israel, but in the majority they resemble Israel, right? Then it gives a list of things which one may or may not do in terms of their status, whether they be considered pagans in one sense or Israel in another sense. Finally, they ask the question, well, why are Samaritans forbidden to enter the Jewish community? Because they've become mixed up with the priests of the high places. In other words, they accuse them of having been influenced by the original pagan priests way back when, that the ancient Israelites never were eliminated. And then Rabbi Ishmael says they were originally genuine proselytes. No, the answer to the Samaritans truly were true proselytes, but then why are they forgiven? Because of the illegitimate females. They married in with the foreigners that were brought in, and they never were properly converted, right? And that's number one. So we have a question about their maternal ancestry. And number two, they do not perform the levirate duty to a married woman, right? When the brother dies and leaves the second, has no children, the next brother is supposed to take the wife. What?
Yeah.
Okay, so they perform chalitza.
Yes.
So that's a complaint. And so there's a question about the purity of their status. But When may they be received into the Jewish community? When they renounce Gerizim and acknowledge Jerusalem and the resurrection of the dead. Because there's a quote where in the top of this says Samaritans denied resurrection of the dead. But if you notice, they do have that as one of their principles today. So that would be removed. And the problem is Gerizim and Jerusalem. That's the only demarcation. From then onwards, one who robs a Samaritan is like one who robs an Israelite, right? In other words, they are the same as us
So
in
it's on
all
6
regards
a.m.?
when they accept
6
Jerusalem.
a.m.? Okay, I will.
Okay.
Bye.
So now for a finale, little musical finale, I'm going to wrap up. I've got some. Let's go ahead here. So we can hear. Go ahead, one more. Okay, let me just stop for 1 second or run ahead. If you listen, you recognize that the melody, the rhythm is very similar to that of Yemenite Jews, right? Something going back the ancient Middle East, at least to the Roman times. There was strong influence in that. Now, some music productions. This Sophie Tzedakah, I assume she's related to Benjamin Tzedakah. I'm not sure what the connection is. It's a fusion of Israeli and original music, we'll call it. And so let's go ahead and where am I? Let it go.
Hi, my name is Sophie. I perform with a band called Sophie and the Baladies. We play traditional Samaritan and classic Arabic music. I grew up on this music. My parents heard Arabic music all the time. I got my inspiration from Faiza Ahmad, Asmahan, Abdul Wahab, Abdul Khalim. I grew up among the Samaritan community. I heard the Samaritan prayers in the Samaritan synagogue. I heard these prayers all my life. For me, it's to hear it, it's like to come back home. Beside me is a folk musician, oud, kanun, percussion, and flute. And we perform in festival, ethnic music, Mediterranean festival music. Music talks all the languages and open hearts and make people close to each other.
Yeah. Go ahead to the next selection. Here's one of her a traditional song, but done, as I say, this
أموراني وبتموشيني والسيد وبنيني وبيدموشي أغشكاني واللي مملاليني وبلواني ومزايني وبتعوني ووشاليني وبغداني ومغموشي الشيلاني وميالي بوشيني وهدي ماني ومي ماشي أموراني وبتي موشيني والسيد وبنيني وبيدموشي أغشكاني واللي مملاليني وبلواني ومزايني بتعوني ووشاليني وبغداني ومغموشي الشيلاني وميلي بوشيني وهدي ماني ومي ماشي أموراني وبتي موشيني والسيد وبنيني وبيدموشي أغشكاني واللي مملاليني وبلواني ومزايني وبتعوني ووشاليني وبغداني ومغموشي النبي الصادق التمام 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 النبي الصادق
Okay, so I'm going to wrap it here for us because I've got one other selection, but it's going to take too long. Hold on, let me get down, let's shrink the screen here. That's it. Okay, I'm going to stop it at this point because it goes. I've got several other selections, but it's going to go on too long. I think you get a sense here. You know, maybe this is a way to bridge between Jews and the Samaritans who have been in the land without interruption, as Israelites, part of the same tradition and heritage, and maybe helping us in merging back in to our historic center. in the shared traditions. So how it will happen of them, they're not very many. Certainly, well, they've gone up from 100 to 700. Quite possibly, many of them will just blend in with modern Israeli